I'm Ifiona Thomas-Lane. I'm a lecturer up at Bangor University, Food Geography, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor David McCracken this morning, who has been working at Scotland's Rural College since 1995 and he has a significant name across Europe for his work in demonstrating the intricacies and the challenges of maintaining the resilience in upland systems particularly, and very much involved at the moment in ecosystem services payments and how they can contribute towards environmental protection, but also maintaining an economic and social infrastructure within the countryside. So without saying any more in English, because it's not my favourite language, I hand over to Davy.
Bore folks, morning. Can I just see if I can share my screen? Oh, it's disabled at the minute. Can someone at the conference end allow me to share my screen? There we go, that's brilliant.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Co-host, so you can share your screen. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. So hopefully, can someone confirm that you can see my presentation now?
I don't think you're sharing your screen yet.
All right.
Share screen at the bottom, the little green thing.
Yeah, I thought, here we go. Right, my apologies. Right, so can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Yes.
Brilliant.
It's fine.
Thank you very much, folks, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you this morning. The previous speaker, Fionn, was talking about people being chameleons. I don't really describe myself as a chameleon, but I certainly wear a number of different hats. But certainly a common feature, as Fiona has said, is over the last 30 years, I've done a lot of work in what we now call high nature value farming systems. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about this morning, particularly with regard to the sort of the session focus on diversity. Hopefully diversity will come through everything that I'm actually talking about here today. And I'd just like to start by saying that quite a lot of the slides that I'm showing today were put together by colleagues in a project called High Nature Value Farming HNV-Link a few years ago, who were specifically pulling together material that can be used for sort of such knowledge transfer events, teaching, etc., etc. So thank you very much to them. Just moving on, I don't know what colour you're seeing it. I'm seeing it in a sort of mucky yellow, but if you live in the sort of yellow or white areas on this map of Europe, then you can be forgiven for thinking that agriculture is very, very intensive. And if you think of nature conservation at all, you'll be thinking of some of the more natural or allegedly natural habitats that occur in small parts of Europe. Nevertheless, that is very much far from the truth. Actually, when you look across Europe, and the green on the map here is supposed to indicate where most of it is, but not all of it. But when you look across Europe, actually, as far as farming is concerned, there is a wide range of still existing farming systems that are actually making use of semi-natural vegetation and existing in a very mosaic type landscape. Excuse me. And we call these type of farming systems high nature value farmland or high nature value farming systems, because many of the habitats that they actually are utilising from an agricultural perspective have been created and need to be maintained by the farming practices, the farming systems. And also those habitats are an integral part of the farming system. They're not a remnant, they're what the farming system needs to utilise in order to actually survive. And they have a high nature conservation importance. Many of the habitats are of high nature conservation importance, even European Habitats Directive importance, and many of the species associated with those habitats are species that we put a high nature conservation importance upon. And one myth to debunk, if you haven't heard much about high nature value farmland before, is when you look across Europe as a whole, or certainly the EU 28 as was, then still about 30% of the EU farmland is under some form of high nature value farming system. So it's not just a little remnant stuck in the corner of Europe somewhere. There's actually a big proportion of Europe's agricultural land is of high nature conservation value, high nature value. And I've no time today to go into the detail about high nature value farming and the different wide variety of types there are. We regard it as a gradient. I'm particularly speaking today about what we call whole farm high nature value farming. That's where the whole farm is actually reliant on these habitats for the forage and fodder if they're actually a livestock-based farm. You can get a gradient through to what we call it remnant HNV, but actually it's basically, you know, Joe Blogg's commercial intensive farmland in much of the lowlands of Europe, whereby you just now have patches of interesting habitat left there. And the whole farm HNV, as I'll illustrate in a second, is particularly rated in some of our more mountainous, remote areas of Europe. But the vast majority of them are some form of multifunctional system involving a wide range of different agricultural practices, many of them involving use of common land, many of them involving seasonal grazing or transhumance, and some of them involving a mix of crops and livestock. As I say, I don't have a time to go through each of these next 7 or 8 slides in detail. I'm just going to flick through them very quickly so as you can get some idea from the pictures of the illustrations of a range of high nature value farmland across Europe, which can be found in any region you can think of from a European perspective. One thing I would like you to just note as we go through many of these pictures is how the high nature value farmland part of these pictures is either below or within the actual tree line. And just to remind people that if those grazing animals weren't there on a regular basis each year, these trees would very rapidly encroach into that sort of grazing land, and the high nature value of that area would actually decrease quite quickly. But high nature value farmland, range of different grasslands, excuse me, or species-rich hay meadows. This maybe doesn't look very much, but there's probably about 50 or 60 plant species per square metre within that hay meadow in Romania. And if you think of the high mountain regions of much of Europe, much of Switzerland, Austria, Bulgaria, Romania, even here in Scotland, we've got these grasslands that are very important from a nature conservation perspective, but also very important from a livestock grazing perspective. But if you go down to the coasts, you know, around the west coast of the Atlantic, whether it's Machair or salt meadows, salt marshes over in Netherlands, or floodplains in Hungary and in Poland and down the Danube Delta, there's a wide variety of different habitats that make up the core of high nature value farming across Europe. Dry grasslands in all their shape or forms are particularly important in the Mediterranean zone. In the Western Atlantic, heathlands and scrub are highly important sources of forage and historically fodder for livestock. And if you go across into the Nordic countries, into the Baltic and into parts of Eastern Europe, you get quite a lot of woodland pasture and grazed forest occurring as well. Again, all part of a high nature value farming system. And you might not think it, but if you go to the north of the Iberian Peninsula, especially in the areas where you've got non-irrigation, you've got quite a mix of crops and fallow land and scrub that resembles the true steppes of sort of Russia and Asia, and again holds a characteristic wildlife species that's very important. And agroforestry, there's a lot of talk about agroforestry in the UK at the moment, although not an awful lot of farmers practicing it. But actually, agroforestry, as Fionn said earlier on, is a ancient system in parts of Europe, whether it's based on actually grazing themselves or grazing under permanent crops like olives or fruit crops. And in many parts of Europe, you see high nature value farming system as a mosaic in the landscape, patches of farmland interspersed with woodland and shrub and old terraces here in this picture from Croatia. The key thing about high nature value farmland or farming is it has a diversity of land cover, a focus on semi-natural habitats, and a low intensity, a low input of the actual farming systems themselves. And it's highly important for a wide variety of European wildlife, whether it's butterflies, whether it's the habitats, whether it's species within those habitats, or whether it's insects and like grasshoppers and crickets, 28% of which are threatened across the EU, many of which are reliant on high nature value farming habitats to occur in. Diversity is the theme of today's session, and certainly you look across Europe, our high nature value farming systems are very diverse, but also the products, the range of agricultural products that can actually appear from those systems is also diverse as well, many of which are protected under the protected designation of origin characterization that came in within the EU a number of decades ago. And they also are very diverse in terms of their cultural importance. So here's a picture of the Cevennes here in France, or Dartmoor in the UK. And given that this is a Welsh conference, then certainly you have a diversity of farming systems, high nature value farming systems in Wales. You might think of the upland systems in terms of the sort of central spine of Wales, but actually there's patches of high nature value farmland down in South Wales itself as well, particularly where there's still a remnant of small fields on heavy soils, etc. The type of system there is still of a high nature value. And when you look across these different farming systems as well as the agricultural products that they are actually producing, they're also contributing, and have been not just for the last few years, but for decades, and in some cases millennia, to a wide range of what we now call public goods, whether that's actually helping with water quality and water availability, particularly down in the Mediterranean area, is a particular issue, and particularly grazing livestock using as a means of wildfire control is highly important in HNV farming systems down in the Mediterranean as well. So there's a wide range of social and environmental goods arising from these high nature value farming systems, more than just the biodiversity that they support as well. And one thing that's usually forgotten is many pictures of high nature value farming systems are of the habitats themselves, potentially with the livestock in them, but actually these are managed lands, and it's a wide diversity of people that actually provide the high nature value farming, and they've got a wide diversity of needs themselves, depending on where they are across Europe. So I've outlined a range of positives there with regard to high nature value farming. So why are we still concerned about it across Europe? Well, unfortunately, there's still a number of sort of constraints facing high nature value farming across Europe and in the UK. Partly from an ecological perspective, for the ecological community or the agricultural community. Both communities are reluctant to recognise high nature value farmland as actually being farmland itself, or of being any real value. Ecological community, certainly in parts of the UK, probably through frustration with the marked changes that we've actually seen on farmland across the low ground of the UK, they are so frustrated with poor agri-environment over the years that to them rewilding is the answer. High nature value farming is not the answer for them. But from the agricultural community's point of view, many of the more commercial agricultural farmers systems and national farmers unions, they see high nature value farming as being small and not very cost effective production. Also, in particular in more recent years, they actually are very reluctant to see a move of agricultural support payments away from the more intensified farming systems that we've seen over the last sort of 40, 50 years. They're reluctant to see a move back into supporting these high nature value farming systems, because that would be taking money away from them. But also something I've heard an awful lot over the last 30 years, particularly from governments and agencies, well, how do we recognise what is high nature value farming? How do we actually reward it? You know, how do we verify that they're producing what you say they're going to be producing? Well, that's not actually rocket science. It's as long as there was a political will there to do it, it's certainly feasible. And what we have now, a situation with high nature value farming systems across Europe, is business as usual. They're stuck in this rut. They either abandon their farming practices and let those areas revert back to nature, which has a biodiversity value in its own right, but nevertheless doesn't actually maintain the open habitat type biodiversity that we associate and value from an HNV farming point of view, or those that can continue to intensify and become much more intensified in commercial farming systems, but lose the biodiversity value themselves. And as it stands at the minute, the existing schemes and opportunities possibly only allow these high nature value farmlands to actually be maintained in some sort of shape or form as museum landscapes, fossilized landscapes to extent. Neither of these scenarios, being fossilized, intensifying or abandoned, is actually good for the nature conservation, nor is it good for the farmers and the farming systems themselves. We need to find a way to increase the socio-economic viability of high nature value farming systems to allow them to be more viable in their own right. And myself and colleagues, a number of colleagues who've been working on HNV farming for a long time, produced a think piece paper published late last year, whereby we were highlighting that it's not really that difficult, if there was a will to do it, to actually recognise what high nature value farming system is actually producing, the wide range of goods and public goods that they're producing themselves, to then ensure that we actually ensure payment systems reward them for the delivery of that goods. And recognise also we don't want to fossilise these systems. It would be a mistake to fossilise these systems. We need to look at innovative approaches to actually allow those systems to actually adapt from a technological point of view, but also innovative approaches in terms of sort of social innovation and then bringing more of these HND farmers together to allow them to build up their own sort of capacity, empower them, so to speak, and also ensure that within these HNV farming landscapes, that other aspects of public policy serve as much as the agricultural or environmental support policy to help maintain a desire to actually keep these farming systems going, and particularly to have successors coming in to those farming systems. And as my colleagues in the HNV-Link project, they designed this bundle of approaches, so a diversity of approaches needed to actually maintain high nature value farming systems through the years. And the key point is that it's a bundle in association. It's not just one or other of these approaches that will be sufficient to actually ensure high nature value farming is rewarded and becomes much more socially acceptable going forward. And with regard to the current state of play we're in with thinking about changes to agricultural and environmental support mechanisms across the UK, what we need to ensure is that high nature value farming systems in the UK that are already producing many of the public goods that government and its agencies say we want to produce going forward, we need to ensure that they are actually supported in doing that. I've been involved in many conversations with government and agencies across the UK where they are continually in a narrow mindset, where they say that we can only support farmers who actually change their practices in order to produce something desired by wider society. Those that are already producing it, why should we be rewarding them for already producing it? Which seems that's a falsehood to myself. If we value the outputs, we should be actually ensuring that those that are already producing the outputs get rewarded just as much as anybody who subsequently decides to change from a more intensified farming system to a more environmentally friendly farming system. But of course, top-down, we can actually have top-down approaches that help facilitate things, but my experience over the last 30 years is if we wait for top-down solutions to be put in place completely, then we will wait forever, and high nature value farming systems will suffer markedly during that time frame. We need to facilitate the development of bottom-up approaches. And if we look across to the Republic of Ireland. Now, certainly all these groups that are operating in the Republic of Ireland over the last 5 or 6 years under the EIP Agri-Operational Group Innovation Programme, not all of these groups on the map here are dealing with high nature value farming at all, but many of them are. And these are being facilitated. It's farmer-led or locally led groups where individuals who are more familiar and aware of what their local issues actually are have been facilitated to come together and try and work on solutions for that. We need more of that across the whole of the HNV farming landscape in the UK and in Europe. We're not starting with a blank slate, and actually it's hot off the press. Colleagues in the European Forum on Nature Conservation and Pastoralism and other colleagues in Ireland have just published a couple of publications highlighting the lessons that could be learned going forward from this range of projects and the potentially more outcome-driven approach that many of them have actually been taken. So what do we need to do going forward? Well, high nature value farming systems have been defined and characterised because of the importance of the nature conservation value, the biodiversity they support. We cannot lose sight of that, and nor can we lose sight of the challenges that HNV farming systems are changing with regard to economic viability. So we need to actually make more of how important they are to the wider rural economy where they exist, and particularly the social fabric of many of these HNV landscapes. If you lose the HNV farming, you lose much of the social fabric of those areas. And we spent, I was complicit in this, we spent a long time highlighting the HNV farming system was important from a nature conservation perspective, but haven't made enough to date of highlighting how they can actually deliver other public goods for society, but that they actually are farming systems and they deliver agricultural products as well. And ultimately, it's trying to develop policy, trying to change policies. It all comes down to politics as much as policies. We need to get the message out to wider society that these HNV farming systems, HNV farmlands, wherever they occur, are important. They're important to wider society, because only through wider society calling for more to be done for those will we actually get many politicians, governments, and agencies to actually change tack with regard to how they actually view these farming systems. So, with thanks to the HNV-Link programme and with thanks to the wider suite of funders that fund what I do within SRUC and my team do within SRUC, and I'll just end there. Thank you very much.
Well, diolch yn fawr iawn, Davy. Thank you very much, Davy, for provoking some thinking there and pointing the finger at this lack of recognition of the value of these high nature areas, but areas that also are maintaining people's livelihoods, as well as maintaining a substantial amount of really unique nature outcomes as well. So I would like now to be inviting questions from the chat for Davy. There are some comments there already about, obviously, the fact about governments needing to recognise the value of these systems, and you were talking about the fact that funders are only, policymakers are willing to fund change rather than maintaining something which dynamically could end up with the wrong outcome in terms of what we're looking for. So while I'm looking for the question, there's one here from Marcus about the silage hay discussion, the fodder crops. How does that work for high nature value systems in your experience across perhaps a couple of countries that you've been working with?
Yeah, so I can only guess, Marcus, where your question is coming from, but it's also a fallacy. Although I was highlighting in my illustrations many of the high nature value, high nature conservation value habitats that form part of high nature value farming systems, it's a fallacy to think that that means that you can only be a high nature value farm if all of your farm consists of some of those sort of habitats. We need livestock to graze these high nature value farming habitats, and that means we need actually livestock to be viable on a farm. And if that means, as it does over many parts of Europe, that any one high nature value farm has some more intensified part of that farm, such as silage production, in order to ensure they've got sufficient fodder for a particular type of livestock during the actual winter period itself. That does not disqualify that farm as a whole from being high nature value. The key thing about high nature value farming is that the dominant but not exclusive part of the fodder and forage and or fodder resources coming from these valued habitats, and so actually having silage possibly more intensified on a small part of the farm does not disqualify it from being high nature value at all. And in fact, we would argue quite strongly that that should be allowed. The trick is making sure that the more intensified farming practices don't then start to become the norm over the farm as a whole, and we then start to see the wildlife value diminish.
Right, thank you. There's a question here from Pat Kaplan. How do you see the future of high nature value in the context of Brexit, and especially possibly a no-deal Brexit? And that's probably combined with Siobhan's question about the changing agricultural bill. So those two are related.
Yep. So I'm not George Eustace, thankfully, and so if we get a no-deal Brexit, then especially here in the UK, where the vast majority of our existing high nature value farming systems, and not exclusively, but the vast majority of them are livestock-based systems in our uplands, then that is going to be a no-deal Brexit for those is going to be extraordinarily, well, it would be catastrophic in terms of taking away the market, particularly for sheep products. And there is no opportunity. Many of these high nature value farming systems have diversified their agricultural production as much as they actually can, as much as conditions allow on the ground. And although some might have the facility to diversify into beef in the long term, they certainly can't make those changes overnight. So, you know, a no-deal Brexit would be disastrous for high nature value farming across much of the UK. Supporting current good practices under the new support mechanisms being touted, and they still are being touted. We've no real clarity as a whole what's to happen in the constituent parts of the UK. HNV farming will only benefit from that if they're actually recognised as being an important part of the agricultural and environmental delivery mechanism. If they're not, they will continue to be dismissed as irrelevant as they have been over the last 30, 40 years, I'm afraid.
Well, I have a couple of questions while we're waiting for a few more perhaps to come up in the chat about the farmers themselves across the different systems in different countries. How do the farmers themselves feel about their role in delivering high nature value rather than food products? Are there any differences or similarities across the countries that you've been working with?
Oh, that's a big question, an interesting question. You know, and that's a question that you know, even if it was posed to one high nature value farmer, you know, she or he can't really speak on behalf of the, you know, the remainder. Certainly, if you go to France, then there's always been a close association with terroir and farmers of all types recognising that they're producing more than just agricultural outputs, and they're actually managing the land. You go to much of Eastern Europe, much of the Mediterranean, you know, these high nature value farming farmers, they do themselves recognise they are doing more for wider outputs than just agricultural production, but they have been sort of disenfranchised for so long that they find it difficult to have their voice. That's why I was highlighting earlier on the need for work to try and empower these farmers, not to allow them to recognise that they're producing more, but to allow them to then be in a better position to explain what they're doing and why it's actually important, and how they are should feature on everybody's radar when looking for agricultural policy development. In actual fact, if you actually step back and look across Europe as a whole, as always, and unfortunately, it's ourselves in the UK that are more unique in that sort of situation. That individual farmers, the culture in the UK, even if you're a high nature value farmer, the culture over the last 40 years has to be to maximise production, produce. So there is this mindset that you can only be a good farmer if you've got a tidy farm and you're producing a lot of what you're actually trying to produce, and so that sends out the wrong message to high nature value farmers in the UK. So possibly HNV in the UK has a wee bit further to go in terms of empowering farmers themselves to stand up and have more of a voice.
So just perhaps possibly the last question, I'm hoping to try and bring two of the questions together about the dialogues between the different stakeholders here. There's some comments here from Phil about lack of understanding and consensus between the nature interests and food producers, and also a comment from Howell about supermarkets being brought into the discussion on high nature value farming. Could you say something about this? Have you seen any evidence that this is actually starting to happen or not?
Well, certainly some of the European illustrations that I highlighted with regard to some of the agricultural products arising from high nature value farming systems, and they are recognised, not just in terms of sort of local shops and niches, but well, you might hesitate to call them supermarkets, but certainly more chains in parts of Europe, as far as appreciating that is what. I was in Italy last year on holiday, and there was some of the larger supermarkets were still highlighting the fact that local produce from sheep grazing in the Italian Alps was an important selling point of the dairy products and cheeses and meat that they were actually selling. In terms of actually bringing the nature conservation and the agricultural communities much closer together, well, that's what we've been trying to do collectively. A wide number of colleagues working in high nature value farming over the last sort of 30 odd years. We need to actually have more focus on the relationships between ecology and agriculture at an educational level, particularly in agricultural colleges, like my own. I created an integrated land management department 18 months ago, or 2 years ago almost now, to try and recognise we can't blame ecologists and farmers for not seeing each other's views if when they go to college or university, we put them in their own separate silos and don't let them speak to each other and don't let them understand each other. So there's a lot more educational work to actually be done to help with that, addressing that sort of issue. Yes.
So thank you. I think that covers some. There are some comments, but perhaps Davy, if you're staying for the rest of the morning, some online. Yep. As you can, it would be fantastic to have you to feed into the discussion, the panel later. But there are some comments on the chat. Perhaps you could have some chats with people and answer some people's questions yourself online as well. There's just one thing before I thank you very much. Is that what is say 3 points you'd like to advise our policymakers in Cardiff and in Westminster? What would you ask them to think about in the agriculture bill?
Reward. I think I'm not going to give you 3. I'm going to give you 1, which is a key principle of ensuring that no one is disadvantaged by any unintended consequences from or no HNV farmer is disadvantaged from any unintended consequences from the actual implementation of the bill itself, and ensuring that those land managers who are already producing the range of outputs and goods that actually in wider society is now recognising and saying that it wants. Those that are already producing it get a reward and are at the front of the queue before we actually move to rewarding others who need to change and need some incentive to change. But actually changing some of the practices in intensive farming could just as easily be done by regulation as opposed to constantly having to pay people to actually change practices. So reward those that are already producing what we want them to produce.
Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Right, so I am sadly going to have to bring the discussion to an end because we have to move promptly into the next session. So, and that will be a panelist chaired by Dr. Prof Williams from Bangor, and we'll have some people there who've got different takes on diversity, but they have also come around in the way that they see what they're doing from day to day, how that contributes, and it would be fantastic to have that bring together with the academic discussions and some of the practical demonstration projects that you've come across, and to actually broaden the discussion out at the end of that panel this morning. So I'm hoping everybody will stay on for that. So Jane, Steve, how do you want us to be doing this now? So thank you very much to Davy for his really valuable keynote speech today. Diolch yn fawr, Davy.